Welcome to Shop Talk Live, episode number 307. We are back after the holiday break, and we are happy to be back. I just said happy really weird, but whatever. Today, joining me on the show is Dan Faia. If any of you are Unlimited members, you know Dan from his incredible series that we're in the middle of releasing right now on building a Queen Anne chair. And we're also joined by Bill Pavlak from Colonial Williamsburg. He's the head of the hay cabinet shop there and another incredible woodworker. It is two monsters of the period furniture world, two skilled craftspeople who I respect and admire, and I'm really happy to have them both on the show at the same time. So enough about it. Let's get on with it. I can't believe it took me this long to pair you two together. First off, Dan, you've been on the show before. When I was up in New Hampshire, and it seems like 10 years ago that we did that, but that was about this time last year that we were recording your video workshop. Yeah, it's
exactly a year. Yeah.
And it is for the Unlimited members, it is still publishing. I think we're on episode like 23 or something. I mean, it is in depth. It's going deep. It's
a lot of information.
A lot of good information though. And but Dan, somebody described you on Instagram, I think, as the Bob Ross of woodworking. And it was like, yes, this is perfect, because you're sitting there carving and like going, it's okay, don't worry about that, don't worry. And it's just the relaxing assuredness of your teaching style is I still find it mesmerizing, even though I've watched that thing like probably 6 times now. But Bill Pavlak, you are the head of the hay cabinet shop at Colonial Williamsburg, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
And when did you start at Williamsburg?
2005. So later this year will be 19 years ago.
Wow, that's a while ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so Bill, you've done a good number of articles for us. You have a very, very unique perspective. At your day job, we'll say you work entirely as you would in the 18th century, right?
Right. Yeah, pretty much.
And then at night you go home and love on your bandsaw, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have my shop here at home is a pretty typical shop in a 2-car garage. Yeah. Mostly hand tools, but some power tools, some machines.
Okay. So what machines do you have?
Let's see, a bandsaw and joiner planer combo are the big ones. Dust collection. I use a big sliding compound miter saw. So I had that always from housework. No table saw though, and that's not for any dogmatic reason. It was just wasn't room in the budget when I was setting up this shop. Maybe someday I would get one, but the next thing will be a good big mortiser.
Okay.
When I come home, I don't want to chop mortises by hand anymore. I'm over that. Great to do it at work though.
And then Dan, you don't have a table saw in your shop either.
Well, update from the last podcast.
Oh no, you caved.
And it was because I have access to other shops, like I had said in the previous 8 podcasts. So I have access to milling equipment and all that. But in the shop now, I have all of the things Bill was just saying. My lathe, my bandsaw. I have a saw stop, table saw in there, mortiser, all of the drill press, all of kind of the hybrid woodworking tools between the machine and the hand tools that you need for small shop woodworking,
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. So one thing that I loved about the idea of having you two on is, so first off, there is, so you have a conference coming up, Bill, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Working wood in the 18th century. And when is that?
That is, January 25th? So
okay.
Every year, this would be the 26th year, always the end of January.
Okay.
3.5 days at Colonial Williamsburg.
Okay. So you are up on it right now. You are right around the corner.
Yeah. feeling overwhelmed at this moment.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for taking the time from your
No
busy
problem,
schedule.
no
Then.
problem.
But then also, Dan, you are speaking at the conference as well, right?
Yeah, I am one of the presenters there. Yeah, I had done the conference back in 2012. It was my first time. It was when they used to do the conference twice, back to back, type of conference, and it was the theme was Mount Vernon, I think. So we got to work with Mount Vernon, go there and measure some pieces, and I did a table. I did George and Martha Washington's breakfast table. Basically, is what I did for the conference. So it was a really neat experience. It was teaching on a different level as far as the stage and the camera work. It was quite impressive, but overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm much better prepared for it now. I know what to expect, how to expect. You can't teach everything in a short amount of time. We all know that anyways, but really trying to be more on point of kind of what's important about what we're going to do. So I'm not sure Bill will talk about the theme here, but basically it was an opportunity for me to take an idea of the theme, the by the book theme, and look at a historic plate and actually translate that into furniture. So the chair that I'm making is kind of my own interpretation of something that already exists.
So for the uninitiated, a historical plate is basically a picture in a book, right?
A picture in a book.
Yeah. So are you doing a Chippendale or what are you doing?
I am not. Bill is you want to talk about the conference, Bill? Like what the conference theme is?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, this year's like every year there's a theme, some sort of overarching structure to all of this. And this year's is by the book. So, 18th century pattern books and technical writings are around, but they are certainly not written for modern woodworkers. So Dan's making an incredibly complicated chair from one engraved image. You get one view of the chair. And, one of the reasons we want Dan to do something like this is there are so many blanks left behind there, so how do you fill in these blanks, and he's looking at a really elaborate Hepplewhite design. I'm doing a chair from Chippendale. I'm kind of cheating. I made the back of the chair at the conference several years ago, where I was doing this sort of idea of really literally taking this thing from the page in 2 dimensions and trying to turn it into a 3-dimensional thing and realize all the details. This time around, I'm kind of using Chippendale the way a lot of crafts people would have, which is as the inspiration for something a little more down market. So here's this really, really fancy piece of furniture. We know that our cabinet shop in Williamsburg owned a copy of Chippendale's book, but they weren't making anything, generally speaking, that ornate. So how do you take this really ornate thing and sort of make it a little more down market? It is still a high style mahogany chair, but how do you start to shed some of those details and still make an attractive design? And all these 18th century writers mention, well, you can do that, but they don't necessarily tell you how or show you how. And then sort of mixing that, and I'm sure Dan will do this too, with just what we know about how they worked. Thomas Chippendale, I mean, you're lucky if you get 3 measurements for anything from Hepplewhite or Chippendale. And so certainly nothing about how many pieces is the back of this chair, how do they get put together and so forth. So by looking at other antiques and then by also looking at other more technical woodworking books, So I think Dan and I's presentations will probably overlap in certain ways. We've talked a little bit, so we don't overlap too much, but end up coming up with very, very different chairs, but with some of the same problems, that a 21st century person would face.
Well, and that kind of brings me to there's a quote by another one of your presenters, because I think Chris Schwarz is going to be presenting. And I remember when he said it, it spoke to me, and he recently reiterated it, but it was basically, he said, I believe in his anarchist design book, something akin to, why would you want to make the furniture of your keepers or your of the people who ruled over the layman of the time. And at the time I was like, heck yeah, man, that speaks to me. Yeah. Revolution, whatever.
Right.
And there is certainly, and if Chris was here, I would totally say, yeah, absolutely. That is certainly a valid perspective. But then just the other day, I'm sitting there watching Dan carve the Queen Anne leg again for the 10th time. And I said, oh, I want to do this so bad. I want to make this chair. And in no point in my life have I ever wanted a piece of Queen Anne furniture. It just doesn't fit with our aesthetic or whatever, right? But I all of a sudden had this realization that, well, learning how to make these things is worthwhile because it is the next step. It is the next elevated form of the craft that we have chosen. And the same way when I was a trombone player, I played in orchestras and learned, all of these crazy, pieces and bebop jazz. I didn't listen to Curtis Fuller at the time, but I learned his solos because it was the next hardest thing to do. And for me, a lot of times period furniture and techniques are brushed aside by a lot of woodworkers coming up because they think, oh, well, that doesn't apply to me. I don't want to make that. But from a skill point, you can't deny the fact that the skills you learn while making period furniture will make you a better modern furniture maker. So for me, what you're saying, Bill, is like you're taking this Chippendale and trying to bring, to take the essence of it and make it into a piece that the hay shop might make. Right.
And it's still a fancy thing.
Yeah. But that Chippendale chair could very easily, or a Queen Anne chair or whatever, could very easily be turned into something that our modern aesthetic would work with as well. Don't you think?
Absolutely. Yeah. Just like responding to sources, whether those are design ideas. It's like, you don't have to take every single thing from a Queen Anne chair to take something from it, the line of a leg or whatever it might be. But also, obviously, the techniques used in the past still remain relevant. There's still a place for handwork, obviously. And I think just always having a chance to go through other people's creative problem solving. The way they have a problem, like how do I put these two pieces together and account for a wood movement, but achieve the look I want or whatever it is. There's so many deep lessons to learn from that. But, for me, I love Chris's point about, you're kind of making your boss's furniture. And do you want that? And I think that's so important because for so long, we've celebrated this stuff because George Washington owned this or, whatever it is, which is cool. And that's an important part of the story. But the way I often look at what we get to do is, the table's the story of whoever owned it, but we're telling the story of the people that made it. And that's everybody else in that 18th century world, right?
Yeah.
And we can give voice to those people and we could make this thing about all these other folks. And also think just one other thing is we need to be conscious of the history of these things and sensitive to it and the context of everything. But we also have this power of being in the 21st century. We can take things out of context and make them make sense for our own world. So it's like somebody like me wouldn't have maybe owned this thing in the 18th century, but I can make it for myself now and have it. And that's kind of a beautiful thing about our moment in time in some ways.
Yeah. And Dan, I mean, your house is filled with period furniture from what I can tell, right? And, but there's probably very few people who have taught more woodworkers than you how to make these pieces. And how, like, when you were teaching, did you ever experience pushback of like, well, I want to make mid-century modern furniture. Why am I learning how to, carve a ball and claw foot?
Right. Yeah, I think I agree with Bill. Like the foundation of the period furniture, the design, you can learn design from replicated design. You can learn about curves and shapes, the joinery. There's only so many ways to join wood together, right? There's mortise and tenon, there's dovetails. If you're trying to build in a certain manner and not modernize everything, um, but that does have a time and place too. Um, and I kind of look at this whole thing like when we were doing the Queen Anne chair video. I mean, I like Queen Anne furniture. I just like the design. I like the shapes. I like the work. I like shaping wood and all that. But to me, that video is not even about the shapes. It's about how to build this thing. How do you clamp up curved pieces? Where do you leave blocks for that kind of stuff? Like that, to me, the problem solving part of that, and that's kind of the cool part about the chair I'm doing for the conference. It's an oval back chair. So there's no square corner to it. How do you clamp it up? How do you assemble this weird thing that goes together? So all of
And
that,
that is not a modern day problem.
no, it's not. And if you're making flat, straight, square things, it's easier to clamp up. There's less of that kind of. It doesn't make it any easier, but it's just different. But if you're going to do curves, whether they're bent laminations or solid, doesn't matter. You still have to find ways to put things together well. And as the kind of the modern, you know, um, professional hybrid woodworker, right? I use machine, I use handwork, I do commission work, I do teaching. I need to be able to do those things at a level. And, so, I kind of look at myself as maybe the 18th century maker. I'm using the technology I have to build the best product I can, and I'm making it for clients who can afford it. And my clients are everything from, uh, pretty common, say simple middle class up to really high-end pieces, depending on what it is. So I can usually design a piece. It's going to be traditionally built, whether it's a traditional design or not, but it's going to be traditionally built as much as it can be. That works within the budget and the needs of the customer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they did in the period. Right? That's what Bill's doing. He's taking a design and he's changing that to fit, a line or a product or a need for the client base. That's kind of what we do nowadays too. So it's the same thing. It's just different times and the history is different. And I think sharing the stories, like Bill said, as much as you can, the more research that is done and the more things that are brought to light. And then with the makers like Bill, the interpreters who can do that stuff at a different level. But there's so much of this period furniture that has no story just because the documentation hasn't been uncovered. There's a lot of pieces like that I'll share during the conference that, they know who carved it, but they have no idea who made it. It's like, how can you not know who made the piece of furniture? It's spectacular, right? But all they know is this little attribution. So a lot of the stuff just hasn't been uncovered or the documentation doesn't exist,
And that's always been a great thing. That's one of my favorite things about my job and even about this conference, although Dan's thing and my thing this year are a little bit different because we're not starting with antiques. But you take an antique piece of furniture and have no idea really who made it exactly, but you can still see their story. You see little layout lines left behind, tool marks here or there, and getting down into that. And it's, sometimes people talk about tool marks as though a tool jumped off a shelf and made a mark. It's like, no. This is something that somebody did, and they did it in a particular way, right? There's thought behind that. So even when we don't know the person's name or the people's names, like we're still getting a little snapshot of this moment in their lives and of their way of thinking through things, and not just all the wonderful, highfalutin, fine woodworking things, but how do you also do that in the context of making a living? Why does this backboard look so lousy, but this other stuff looks beautiful? And so there's enough hints of the story that, I talk mostly to people that aren't woodworkers, just to the general public coming in, and they all respond to that sort of stuff. Once you start looking at stuff in a way where you're really focusing on the makers, it becomes a very human story, and people start to identify with it. It's like, oh no, I've screwed things up before, and this piece in a museum, somebody screwed that up and then they made it work. That's like, it's everybody responds, to that sort of thing. And so just having all of these examples of that is really wonderful, and being able to share those kinds of stories with folks.
Well, let's jump into one of the questions, because I think this is going to this is leading to this question really well. This question is from Rex. Uh, one of my favorite people. And Rex was a student of yours, right? Right, Dan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If it's the same Rex you're thinking of.
Yep,
Yes.
it is.
Yeah, he was. Yes.
All right. So Rex writes in, George Walker brilliantly discussed his process and tools taken to obtain permission, observe, measure, document, and prepare reproduction drawings from an Ohio tall case clock and copying museum pieces. Fine Woodworking issue 186, September, October 2006. Technology such as the common use of cell phones, having cameras as flashlights, as well as circumstances and museum practices change with time. At Fine Woodworking Live, Bob Van Dyke shared photos of he and Will Neptune observing, noting details, measuring, and documenting features to reproduce a famous Connecticut highboy chest. Will the Shop Talk panel please list, explain, and discuss the tools taken, best practices, and procedures for inspecting, measuring, and documenting a furniture piece while at a museum? And I'm sorry, Bill gets to answer this first because,
Good.
Dan, you have a 6-hour video that we did. Bill, you have written a blog about this in the past, but Dan has documented his process more than anyone
Right.
probably before or will ever again. So
Yeah, and I mean, I have a weird perspective on it because I work in a museum. So I can just email somebody and be like, hey, can I come look at this? Or the fact that I work in a museum will open the door to other museums. But I think first things first is obviously get in touch with the curator who's responsible for whatever it is you want to look at well in advance of your wanting to look at it. Don't be at a museum and expect to be able to get hands on with the thing, later that day or something. Make sure you get from them what sort of the rules of engagement are, not just what can you touch and what can't you touch. That's important stuff, but what can you do with this information? And they'll tell you, can you share all of your findings? What can you share photographs of, and so forth. If you want to have an opportunity to go back to a museum, you need to make sure you're doing that. Some museums are very open. Others have like licensing agreements with outside furniture makers. And so they might let you copy a piece for one-time personal use, but they're not going to let you make a production line of these things from Monticello and be able to use their name in advertising and on and on and on. So, it's kind of like the various copyright agreements and so forth. So make sure you sort of figure all that out, probably before you get there, or don't be surprised if there are going to be certain restrictions, but basically, before you go, the other thing is know the piece as well as you can, study pictures of it well, make a detailed list of measurements you want to take and information you want to get, make a detailed list of photographs you want to take. I've never looked at an antique where I wasn't surprised by something, which is wonderful. It makes it more exciting, but it's a distraction too. So it's like, oh my gosh, I didn't expect that over there. I'm going to focus on this for 20 minutes. And now it's like, oh, I only have 2 hours here. And now I got to rush to get everything done. And if I have a checklist to fall back on, it helps me stay a little bit disciplined. Also, often you're in a space with the thing you're studying, but all kinds of other really interesting things. And so that thing that you're incredibly interested in and have traveled far away to study, all of a sudden becomes the least interesting thing in the world because there's all this other cool stuff around you. And you kind of have to give yourself a moment to be distracted by that, but then get into it. Respect the time of the curator or whoever you're working with. It might be, an intern or somebody that's just sort of, look, you're going to have to be babysat, and so, for insurance reasons and so forth. But also respect their knowledge. You might know a lot about this stuff, but they might also have some interesting insights. So don't forget to ask them some questions about a piece, and most importantly, ask them about the condition of the thing. Like, are there parts that they know have been replaced? Do you want to spend 30 minutes studying details of a leg that turns out it was replaced later and they don't think it's right or so forth, so they'll have a lot of, hopefully, or potentially some background information to fill you in. And that's none of that is like the nuts and bolts of doing the work, but I think all of those are sort of important, upfront things. But beyond that, I mean, just have tools that, typical measuring tools, but have wood and plastic versions of those.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, museum folks don't want a tape measure, or metal rule or metal calipers, things like that. There are typical workshop fare. I would make, if I'm studying a chair, I'd make either get just a hardware store yardstick, or just bring some story sticks to just make marks directly on. I like to have, things, just some extra non-traditional or things that you might not think of. I like to have a stack of index cards, and some scissors too, so I can cut little slips. It's like, how deep is this mortise? Well, there's a little gap. Can I just gently stick a little bit of a stiff index card in there to feel a little bit, or can I take a bunch of little pieces of index card and put them around a form and just kind of tape a bunch of flat pieces together to sort of get a sense of a curve if I can't trace it. Can I trace things or can I not? There's another sort of rule you need to ask about. Definitely bring a flashlight in addition to the flashlight on your phone, because sometimes you want to take a picture of something, but you need light inside of a case piece, for example, coming from another source. Use your phone and its camera as creatively as you can. It's so nice that a phone is flat, and it can take the place of a mirror. Sometimes you can slide it inside a piece and put a light in there and then take a picture of something where you can't fit your head in that, between those partitions and look up. So kind of use your phone creatively. Gosh, I mean, if you can trace things, like if you're trying to study inlay work, like a Mylar sheet or something like that, just putting something that's clear and hard, that'll kind of protect the wood underneath, but you can draw gently on. I feel like I'm talking about this too quickly, but just really think through at home every measurement you want to make and what you could have on hand to help you do that. And are there things that you need to make up? I'm sure Dan talks about this in his video, if he talks about it all, but like a little, what we call tracing mouse, a block of wood with a pencil stuck into it so that the block of wood is touching the work and that the pencil really isn't. So you're not leaving pencil lines behind on antiques. Bring some nitrile gloves, Every museum's a little bit different about this. Some objects best not to touch with gloves because you'll lose a little bit of control with your hands. And if you have clean hands, it should be okay. But generally, any sort of metal work, if it's antique metal work, they don't want you to wear gloves to handle that. So that could just, you're opening a drawer. I'll usually just pull my shirt down over my hand, and that way there's something between my skin oil and other things. And you'll probably see curators do that. Also ask curators what it's okay for you to do. Can I flip this thing over? Don't try to move things that are awkward and heavy by yourself, obviously. And then, I think that's a really quick rundown of some of what I think about. One of my favorite, just random little tips, comes from my longtime colleague, Brian Weldy. He's the master joiner at Colonial Williamsburg now, and a friend of Dan's, North Bennett alum too. But I don't know if this is a North Bennett thing or a thing that Brian came up with, but a pair, like a compass, like your basic compass that has a removable point and lead. Take the lead and the point out, stick toothpicks in there, and now you have like this really great way to measure like details and carvings and other things. But the toothpicks are totally safe to touch the wood.
Huh.
That's one of my favorite little. Brian Weldy for the win on that one. Every time I'm studying an antique, like, damn it, Brian, how you be so clever?
That is a very obvious seeming thing, but
no, it's a MacGyvered sort of compass that is very safe for antiques, but accurate too. So,
Dan, what's the strangest thing you've ever found while, like, because when we were doing that video, I thought it was great. And if I'm gonna pat myself on the back, it's about the fact that we had hooked up. You were taking photos of Phil's chair with my phone.
Yeah.
And I had hooked up an HDMI output of the phone. So we were
Right.
like in the video, we're looking at your perspective as you're taking the photo.
Yeah.
And there's one point where you're like, huh, look at that little squeeze out right there. And it was like, Phil Lowe left a glob of glue on this chair.
In that spot. Yeah.
In that spot. And I feel better about myself now. Like everything that I've done wrong in woodworking is now a little bit more okay.
Yeah.
What's the strangest thing you've ever found, Dan?
Well, that's
sorry
that's
to
a hard
nail
one
you
to
with
say,
one. Yeah.
But well, strange, I don't know, but you find a lot of layout for ornamentation on parts that don't show. So if something has an inlay to it, you'll see the compass work on a drawer bottom or inside of a case. So it's always interesting to find something that you don't expect at that part of the piece. You know what I mean? So
like notes of the layout to come or something kind of inside the piece?
Not like written notes, but layouts. So they could have a pair of dividers of how they, laid out, a pad array pattern or some kind of an inlay pattern or things like that. And it could have been an extra piece of wood they had in the shop that they did that and it just got incorporated into that piece. Or maybe they just said, well, here's the flat board. I'm going to go do this. Let's just do it now. Who knows? But you find odds and ends in it, whether it was from something else and they're just using the wood or whether it pertained to that piece, may or may not be evident at that point. But the two things I was going to add to Bill's thing was great. I would bring a furniture blanket or furniture blankets with me to lay down because the museum may or may not have them. It depends on where you're going to go, because if you want to flip things over and turn it over, they're going to get it off its feet. And the other thing Bill had mentioned that is trying to be respectful of their time. So usually in my emailing or in my conversations, if it gets to that point, I'll tell them about how much time I would like to have with the piece and see if that's acceptable. And then if I've never worked with the museum before or that curator before, I will explain everything I'm trying to get and what I want to do as I go to touch the piece. So then if they're comfortable with it, great. If they're not comfortable with it, they'll say, well, I'm not comfortable with that. And you find another way to do it. You try to work around that. But the other great advantages of cell phones now, especially with work that's got shaping work to it or carving work to it, as I take all the photos like we talked about, but I also take some video. Because sometimes in the photo, you just can't turn it far enough to see what you want to see, But if you go back to the video, you can actually get some depth, some 3D perspective of some of that stuff too, which is helpful.
I love this aspect of the communication before the thing happens. And Bill, you speaking on like expectations for not only what to expect going into the thing, but what you're able to do with it. It's not necessarily something that I think many people have realized. Have you, Dan, have you ever been in a situation where it's like, you can do, and you don't have to name names or anything, but you can measure this and you can make one for your client, but I don't want you to ever do an article on it or anything like that.
Yeah, it was more recently, I think it's less of an issue. Like when I first used to go, maybe let's say 20 years ago, I would go to the museum. There would be paperwork to sign, documentation that you weren't going to do what you could do, what you couldn't do. A lot of museums may or may not have that now. I haven't had to do that for a long time. A lot of the measurement work that I've done, I don't do a lot of true reproductions for customers. I usually do kind of interpretive work. Most of the research type stuff that I'll do that takes measuring is usually more for kind of museum work. So if I'm going to do a presentation or do some sample work for them or a conference like this. And what I've done with that is like I had done a copy of Ralph Waldo Emerson's writing chair and Henry David Thoreau's writing desk. They're not super, ornate pieces, but I did those for the Concord Museum in Concord, Mass. And what I did is I copied those, I traced them, measured them, photographed, did everything that we talked about. When I was done, I gave them the reproductions because that's what they had hired me to do. But I gave them the drawings, the tracings, and the photographs. So they have all of that information. So basically, if they ever wanted to do anything with it, but they also have it. But also it was one of those things, the most requested piece that I've had after that was Henry David Thoreau's writing desk. I've had more people ask me to make that pine desk again which I won't because it's the museum's desk and I don't want to make 1,000 of them anyways. But nowadays I just give them that material back.
Okay. You know, interesting. Interesting. So have you found divider notes and everything too, Bill? You seem to agree with that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You see interesting things. Coin Williamsburg also has a great collection of architectural fragments, architectural woodwork, and there's some really, really cool things. Worked up full, like very detailed drawing of a front door, basically the whole entryway, or little notes. But yeah, we see that all the time on furniture. Sometimes it's stuff that's clearly the guys who made it. Other times it's just those little signs that somebody used this. I've seen a few times, and it's from later generations, but somebody's doodle of just the silly person's face, on the top of a drawer bottom or whatever.
Yeah.
Those little kinds of things. But again, there's almost always, as I said earlier, a surprise or two or three when you look at something. You think it's built a certain way. I think something that I've experienced myself, and then I've experienced countless times as I've been along for the ride with somebody who's looking at an antique for the first time. It's really easy to be disappointed. Look at 18th century stuff, and we literally look at it on a pedestal in a museum, and we kind of elevate it to such an extent. And then when you see it in real life, you start to see, there's kind of a gap over there, and there's like this. That's a little bit sloppier than I thought it would be. All these little things that I've gone on this sort of arc many times in studying a piece. Go to it thinking it's the greatest thing ever. I'm so excited to reproduce it. Walk away thinking, I don't know if this is good enough to make a copy of. And then as soon as I start making the piece and start making the same mistakes and coming up with the same solutions, all of a sudden it's like, this is a really great piece of furniture. It sort of goes through this cycle for me. But I know a lot of people that haven't looked, great furniture makers, maybe haven't looked closely at great museum pieces before. And when they do, often come away a little bit surprised, and I think that's just speaks to the economic realities of the people doing this work. And, not every mortise was cut by the master. Some of them were cut by a relatively new apprentice or, whatever it may be, but it was sort of good enough for the job. But I think those, again, are some of those great object lessons in these pieces. What's good enough? What's been repaired a million times? Why has it been repaired a million times? So forth.
Very cool. All right. Well, I think we should take a little break. Real quick, I want to tell you about Fine Woodworking's e-learning course, Veneering with Tom McLaughlin. The course starts January 17th, 3 Q&A sessions with Tom, live, like interactive Q&A sessions. If you are interested in adding veneer to your woodworking repertoire, this is the best chance you have to do it. You'll have full access to someone who is a master of veneering. Finewoodworking.com/veneering course. To get more information, again, finewoodworking.com/veneering course. Course opens January 17th, and I think there's a big old discount right now. Okay, so this question is from Mozzie. And Mozzie, I replied to his email with your article a while back because I did not want Mozzie to be left hanging. But Mozzie is, here's his email. I'm 12 and I live in Philadelphia. I listen to your podcast regularly. I can never say that word. Regularly, and have a question I wanted to ask. Can you resaw larger pieces of lumber with hand tools? I don't have access to a bandsaw and I don't want to use a table saw. And I can't think of two people better to answer this question because, Bill, you literally get paid to do this at work, right?
Right.
And Dan, you do not have a large bandsaw that you're resawing pieces with. I'm sure you wander down to Matt's shop or something and resaw, but I have no doubt you've done this before.
Yeah. For me, because I'm not strictly working with hand tools, but there are going to be times that you're limited by the machines you have access to. So even on a lot of large bandsaws, the resaw capacity is not that big, depending on
Yeah.
what you're doing. I've had boards that I've had to resaw that are, 24 inches wide. So how do you do that? The bandsaw might have access to it, can't do that, or without taking the guards off and doing silly things. Um, so, like I know here in the question, they don't want to use the table saw. You're limited by height on the table saw, but a lot of times what I'll do is I'll flatten a face and I'll square two edges. So scribe a line on that. A lot of times I'll run it on the table saw all the way around on all four edges if it's not too big, just to kind of create a curve and a trough. And then I just use a hand rip saw and I go in from each corner, just kind of go in each corner, all four corners, and then go from either end. So if I have any discrepancy, one way or the other, because I'm maybe not as proficient with the handsaw as folks who do it all the time, then if I'm off a little bit from either end, it's usually okay in the middle. So I've done like large mahogany planks that way. But if you have something like this and you're using really valuable wood, one thing I would consider doing is actually maybe not doing it myself and finding somebody who does a good job with like a wood miser, something like that. You could lose a little bit more kerf, but you're going to get a pretty nice cut all the way through, and they usually can give you some pretty wide widths on those too. So something to think about.
How much of a kerf are you going to expect to lose at resawing by hand?
For me, I'm going to work within my table saw kerf that I'm going to give myself for the most part. So whatever, an eighth or light eighth or something like that. With a bandsaw mill, I don't know if it's much. I don't know. I don't think it's a quarter. I think that's a lot. It's probably an eighth to 3/16, depending on how well the saw's tuned up, stuff like that too. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I would expect to lose an eighth anyways. But then, the general rule for me for resawing is whatever you're resawing off, you want to leave yourself enough rough thickness to be able to flatten the board again. So typically like a quarter, I think of a quarter of an inch is a kind of a typical, if you're going for a 3/4 inch board, you start with a 4/4 inch, 4/4 board, right? So you go for that. So if I'm going to resaw off 1/4 and resaw it in half, I could probably get 3/4 inch boards out of that, depending on the species and how much it's going to move and stuff like that. So I'm more interested in what the wood's going to do before I resaw it. So a lot of times when I take an end cut of that board, I'll just bandsaw rip it or just rip it to see what it does. If it's cups and moves a lot, I'll do that before I actually resaw the big piece. It's just take an end cut and kind of resaw it. See what happens from there. Anyways,
so Bill, what I mean, you do this more than anyone probably. I can't imagine anyone resawing by hand more than you and your folk. So what are you doing? Have you ever used one of those kerfing planes? Is that something you use at the shop?
When people ask us about those, and we always make it like we're too cool for that. It's a terrible answer. No, I don't think they were doing that in the 18th century.
Okay.
Using a curvy plane to do exactly what Dan said with the bandsaw. That's obviously a really clever idea to create that kerf all the way around that helps guide the saw. But because we're doing it regularly, we find we just don't need it. It was like it's an extra step.
Oh, okay. You are too cool. So I broke one of my rules though, and I pulled like an esoteric thing out, and I didn't explain what it is. A kerfing plane is, it looks like a molding plane, but there's like a shallow saw blade in there, right?
Right.
So you can register up like a fence against the side of the board and basically add a kerf in like with a hand plane. Okay.
Yeah.
So so for
you're
those
just creating a track for the saw to drop into, which is, it's a nice thing. And really, we don't use them in the hay shop because we don't think anyone was doing that in the 18th century or that we know of. And you get comfortable starting with the saw. I think using a typical panel saw, right? Maybe like a 26-inch long blade. If, obviously there's also the big frame saws to use for resawing. We'll use those once we get over like 12 inches in width. We'll start to move to like a 2-person saw. But I think you could probably go up to like 14 or so inches with a panel saw. It's just so much work.
What
right?
what TPI are you going to have on that panel?
You want to use the most aggressive that you can.
Okay.
And so for most typical resaw jobs, I'll use it's like 5.5 teeth per inch saw, which is fairly aggressive. We do have got some here at home too that are like 4 TPI. I usually don't use those. That's like really, for me, that's a lot. I think if I'm sawing veneer, which I don't do a lot of, our harpsichord makers in the cabinet shop do resaw veneer regularly, and it's like that's something you can do, which is amazing. Usually like an 8 tooth per inch is sort of nice. If you just have sort of one saw, I think like a 7 tooth per inch saw is a nice. I've got one saw for doing rip cuts and resaws. I think that's a pretty good thing. The learning how to resaw isn't so bad. It's a lot of time, to resaw a wide board. No matter how thin the piece you're cutting off is, that's not the real story. The real story is how wide the board is. That's where all your work is, right? But the wider the boards, the plus side to that is that's a lot of wood surrounding a wide saw blade, which is going to make it hard to cut a squiggly line. Whenever we talk about resawing with non-woodworkers all the time, and we'll hold up veneer, and I can't even cut a straight line, or I can't cut a loaf of bread, or piece of, a slice, a block of cheese. It's like, well, bread and cheese are soft. That wide saw blade is going to, interact with the wood in a way that you can't swerve really quickly. You will slowly drift off course, but that's happening slowly. So you learn how to get things back on track. The problem now, though, is that it's harder to get things back on track. So you'll sort of learn strategies, and sort of like Dan was saying, you switch sides. So I always think about it as sawing a series of triangles. I'm going to clamp the board in my vise almost vertically, but just cocked away from me a little bit, so I can start on the corner closest to me, follow the line down the edge in front of me, but also follow the line across the top. Okay. And at first, that wide saw blade is going to be really unwieldy. So you steady it with your thumb, and you just try really hard to get a good cut. If you find yourself really starting to get off, go to the other side and try to meet in the middle and correct things. If you make it great all the way across the top edge of your board and you're on your far corner, stop sawing. Don't saw down that line you can't see. Turn the board around, kind of like a lot of people will cut a tenon, right? It's basically cutting a tenon is a mini resaw, right? So cut until you get to that far corner, and then switch sides and saw from that corner until you bottom out in your first cut on the other side, and then switch back to that side. And so you're always cutting in these angles. I think switching sides helps too. If your saw or you have a tendency to pull in one direction or the other, that kind of helps even things out. This is a marathon thing, especially when you get into greater widths. You're getting into 8 inches, 10 inches. I mean, that's even if it's 2 feet long, that's a lot of wood to push through. So we're getting into a good rhythm and just, no death grip on the saw. I mean, I'm barely holding the saw. My arm is just setting that tool in motion. It can be a lot of work and it can be miserable in certain ways, but it's one of those things, like, I've always enjoyed doing it. It's a little bit like mowing the lawn, where I don't necessarily love it, but it's also something like you're creating this whole like cloud of noise around yourself and busyness. and so nobody's going to bother you. And you kind of get into this rhythm, and your mind, you're paying attention to what you're doing, but your mind goes to other places. It's that sort of heavy, repetitive work that can become almost meditative in a way. I don't think that's what you're really asking about, but yeah, it should. When it's going well, you'll get into that point where it's like, this isn't tiring me out because I have one board to do, and it's actually kind of nice. But it's learning how to use the saw and sort of find that rhythm. Unfortunately, resawing is really going to demand that you know how to sharpen a saw. Because you're going to wear them out quickly by moving through all that wood, and that too much set, the saw can't really guide itself well anymore. It also gets really hard to push. not enough set, it's going to bind in the cut or just be too hard to steer things back on track when things do start to drift a little bit one way or another. I think people talk about saw sharpening maybe in too lofty terms where it has to be absolutely perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to be sharp, And if you haven't sharpened a saw before, just find a really cheap, lousy saw that has a configuration of teeth that's similar to the better saw that you want to use, and just screw up on that a few times. But it's not as bad as most people think, especially with larger teeth.
Wouldn't it be easier to learn how to sharpen a rip saw than a crosscut saw?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And in fact, in the hay shop, we sharpen all of our saws to rip. It's like built on this whole thing that we don't know about necessarily with the 18th century. But when you see saws advertised in the 18th century, they're not selling crosscut saws or rip saws. They're just selling a saw. And so years and years ago, spearheaded by Jay Gaynor, a former director of trades and tool historian, we decided, it was before my time in the shop, to experiment. Well, what if we just sharpen everything for a rip cut? Play around with like the angle, like the rake angle on the teeth. And yeah, there are times like cutting a shoulder on a 10 and a crosscut saw is going to be better. But for the most part, just using more teeth, a saw with more teeth will give a cleaner result. We're almost never creating a saw cut that we're not then again planing, So we always file everything rip, and say 9 times out of 10, feel fine about that.
Back saws too?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. Like, I feel like this should be front page news.
It's a debate, and so we decided years ago let's try it, right? Let's experiment. What if we only sharpen everything to rip? And again, it's before my time. And it works. Like, again, once in a while, I'm doing a really fine crosscut, and I wish I had, like a carcass saw file for crosscut, like I have right behind me here. But you'll learn how to do it, and play with the angles of the teeth a little bit. But
and it makes sense from a historical context where it's likely the master is not making or is not sharpening the saws at the end of the day. It's probably an apprentice, right?
Potentially. I think there's different traditions there.
Okay.
I mean, that there's so little great written about that. I mean, you get like the more modern sort of Frank Klaus tradition where he talks about sharpening tools all day long and so forth. But then you also have like this cynical approach that I came up in with the guys that I started working with in the hay shop years ago, where it was like, yeah, you're the new guy. I do not want you sharpening my saw.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. And with the English tradition that we're very much working in most of 18th century America, most of those workmen, journeymen and so forth, would own their own tools. And saws, those big saws, were incredibly expensive, really expensive tools. So do you want to give it over to the new person?
Okay.
I don't know.
Interesting. All right. So
one more thing, Ben. I just want to say one more thing on the resawing. When I was talking about doing a bigger panel. Most of the resawing that I do, or that most woodworkers encounter, are going to be smaller parts. So like with the chairs, right? You use an 8/4 or 12/4 wood to be able to get the thicker parts that you need. You're going to resaw those things. So you're resawing things that are 2, 3, 4 inches wide. That's probably a whole lot more common than the 27-inch wide board or whatever it is. Anyways, so.
Yeah.
Rip saw, bandsaw, table saw. I think any of it works.
Get it done.
Mm-hmm.
All right. We've got time for one more question. I think the draw knife question. Y'all good with that?
Sure.
This question's from Jason. What is the correct profile or way to sharpen a draw knife? Primary, secondary bevels, flat back like a chisel, or plain blades, or something else? I have an old JS Cantello folding draw knife that needs to be sharpened and no idea how it's supposed to be done. I got it from my grandpa, who might have gotten it from his dad or father-in-law. It's that old. 1883 patent date. Blade is decently hard. File hardly takes anything. So How are you? I assume. I know both of you use draw knives, and but I know, Dan, you have an affinity towards like crusty old tools. So if you are if you're picking up a draw knife, how are you finding or how are you figuring out that first sharpening of it?
Well, I I saw the question. I saw the photos that he sent a couple of photos to show us the
Yeah.
knife. The one thing I learned early on is that when you look at the draw knife, there's some of them that kind of look like a chisel edge. They have kind of a flat primary bevel in a flat back to it, but also the handle orientation to the cutting edge is really what's going to tell you whether it's a bevel up or a bevel down knife.
Mm-hmm.
So I would definitely, I'm no expert on draw knives. There's just, there's lots of folks, chair makers that do a lot more of this stuff. But there's great videos that Curtis Buchanan had done that are on YouTube that are free. He talks about bevel up and bevel down and sharpening and all that. I think he did an article for Fine Woodworking on it as well. And I think Brian Boggs has a video for Lee Nielsen. So there's tons of information out there from really good sources. But my 2 cents on that kind of stuff is that if you look at the handle orientation, if you grab the handles and you look at the cutting edge, and if you're holding a let's say like a bevel down knife where you're going to put the bevel down, the flat sides up, usually the label of the stamp is facing you anyways. That's a typical way to see that if it has a mark on it. But usually if it's a bevel down knife, when you actually hold the handles, it should look like that. If you drew that towards you, it would look like it would want to cut. If you did the other way, it would actually look like it wanted to dive down. You can usually tell that with a knife edge too. Knife edge isn't like a pocket knife where it's on the same on either side, but it has a larger primary bevel. It's flat on the back and has a little tiny back bevel. I don't know. I don't know angles or anything like that. It has to be enough of an angle to hold up. But what you're looking for, I think, for a lot of the green woodworkers, chair makers and spoon carvers and stuff like that, they might have more opinions on one way or the other. My thought is I think a bevel down knife is pretty easy to control. It's easy to learn on. It's harder to take heavy cuts on, but that's what I like about the knife edge knife that I use is I can be really delicate. I can control it lots of different ways, but I can be aggressive when I want to, and I can not be aggressive when I don't want to be just from practice. But I think by looking at what the previous owner had done to it, as long as they kind of knew what they were doing, you could try mimicking what's there. Just get it sharp with your stones and see how it works before you grind it. Don't grind anything. Don't go at it without having some information.
Bill, are you measuring a bevel angle on draw knives?
No. And I really don't use draw knives a ton. But when I do, it's mostly bevel down. One other thing I would say is when you're using a tool like that, like a carving chisel, bevel down, you don't want that bevel really rounded because you lose control. You keep having to tip it up, and you want to try to ride on that bevel. But I think, like Dan mentioned, it's nice to have it just like the tiniest bit rounded on the edge, which like the degree of rounding that would happen from stropping a tool rather than from intentionally like putting a micro bevel on or something like that. So, really being able to ride the bevel is so important. And having said that, my draw knife in the hay shop is one that our blacksmiths made a few years ago. And so it's really cool and beautiful because of that. And it's a nice tool, but they didn't grind it out perfectly. So the bevel on that one is a little rounded, and I didn't want to grind all of that out, and take the time to do it. So I just make it sharp, and over time that slowly sort of come out. I don't have as much control with that, but I'm usually using it just to rough out material really quickly.
Yeah.
So unlike maybe some chair makers and so forth, where you really can do very, very controlled things with it, I don't have that expectation on it. So I guess long story short, I don't have to worry about it terribly much. It just needs to be sharp, but I think for a lot of people using a draw knife, the ability to ride on that bevel is really nice. It's such a small little bit of real estate there, but it does make a difference in terms of giving you control over the tool.
So when you are writing on a bevel, you do not want a micro bevel added to it because you're technically not, right? Am I wrong there?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Uh, what is it? Like Peter Galbert in his book on, also another really good source for draw knife use and sharpening and so forth. I mean, he just says you want the edge. I think he says it dubbed. Like, so,
yeah.
So like you should barely be able to see it. Like you shouldn't have to sharpen for 5 hours the next time to remove that little rounding, but it's just barely rounded. That way the tool doesn't want to just grab too hard. You have to just tilt it just the tiniest bit. But again, I kind of take the same approach I take to sharpening a carving tool, where I'm trying to keep it really flat, but then I'm going to strop it. And that probably creates just this tiniest, almost hard to see sort of rounding. That's
the photos that Jason sent in, it does not look like the knife needs a lot of work. It looks like it'd be a nice usable knife, right? Right, Dan?
Yeah. It actually looked like the bevel on it was pretty long, longer than I expected for kind of a bevel down, because I think it's a bevel down knife, but it's hard to tell without seeing. But it's in nice shape, not a lot of nicks in the edge or anything like that. I think I would just hone it and see how it worked. Yeah. That's really what I would do. And I do that with a lot of old tools. A lot of the times, if I don't know a lot about it, or like Bill was saying with carving tools, if I get an older carving tool that has kind of a unique sharpening edge to it, I'll just hone it the way that it is and try it. Because I want to know what that other maker was doing or thinking, or what were they doing? Like, why is it like this? Was it just because they just didn't know it was a mistake, or was there something really cool about it?
Yeah, so there might be a very good reason or a very good lesson to learn from someone in the past. Right. Yeah. Interesting. So, all right. So I know where you two are going to be in January 25th. Where can people find more information about working wood in the 18th century, Bill?
You can go to the Colonial Williamsburg website, and under like the Learn tab, there's a thing about educational conferences. And so you can find information that way. And then, we've got Dan and Chris Schwartz and then Whitney Miller, who wrote the book on Henry Boyd, the
cool.
Black cabinet maker in Cincinnati. Totally different perspective on Buy the Book, somebody who's actually written a book about woodworking, but not necessarily for woodworkers, for children. So we thought it'd be really cool to have her point of view there. So hopefully all those folks will be talking about, what they're doing. And I mean, I'm not trying to give away everything, but talking about the conference on my Instagram, which is just my name.
Yep.
Yeah.
And there's been some previews of the Hepplewhite chair on your Instagram, right?
Yeah, so I've been sharing that on Instagram. For that, I do stuff on my blog through my website, so dandafaya.com. My Instagram is @danfayawoodcarver. I mean, I'm full out on the conference prep, and kind of doing my digital version of that stuff today, working on some of my images and presentation work, and back in the shop carving. Hopefully carving tomorrow, and
getting the PowerPoints together.
Yeah. I've been thinking about that. Like, I'm not a purist kind of interpretation woodworker, which I would love to be, because I think that's the coolest thing. I think Bill and Brian and all those guys get the coolest job with the coolest clothes. But I feel like, for what I do, I'm doing my 18th century PowerPoint, so that's what they had. I'm taking pictures with my digital camera and all that stuff. And if anybody's interested in things like that, I do workshops as well as commission work. So if people are interested in learning more about traditional woodworking, that's kind of what I do. And my schedule is on the website as well. So.
Rollinsford, New Hampshire is a beautiful place to be. I recommend staying in Dover, and I know. I have like my go-tos up there. I know all my, I spent a lot of time up there. So check out both places, and Colonial Williamsburg in general is a wonderful place to visit as a woodworker. We get a lot of people asking about like, hey, where should I go on vacation, or what should I check out? And my family and I went last year, and we had an absolute blast, and really, really cool place. And so working wood in the 18th century if you are not doing any. Is there an online version this year, Bill?
There is, yeah. So
Okay.
I think at this point, most of the in-person things are taken up, but there's definitely, we do a virtual component as well. And, I think, there's obviously unlimited spaces for that. So check that out.
And then is that archived? Can people watch that?
It is, yeah. You don't have to watch it while it's happening. It's only up for a certain amount of time. I don't know when we'll take it down this year, but probably be up certainly through February, well into March. So you'll have
so if you're busy
to watch it.
If you're busy and this stuff sounded interesting to you, this is definitely a great way to get it.
Yeah, and January is a hard time to travel. We get that. So for a lot of reasons. So happy one of the upshots of the pandemic pivot to ways of thinking was that finally we were able to do what I've wanted to do for a number of years, which was also have it streamed virtually. So
it's awesome. Well, cool. Well, thank you both for being on.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Well, that does it for this episode of Shop Talk Live. Thank you so much to Bill and Dan. If you have any questions you'd like answered on the show, please send them into shoptalk@taunton.com. If you are on iTunes and want to give us a 5-star review, it does help spread the word. And if you can give us a thumbs up on YouTube, that's always appreciated as well. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Thanks for listening.